So every day I get comments like this on my YouTube. And I wanted to chat to a fellow female comedian, and I don't know why I need to preface her gender, but apparently I do, because I wanted to chat with her about this preconception and stereotype that women aren't funny. So joining me today on my first episode of Not Here to Fuck Spiders is the hilarious comedian Gilli Apter. Now, I had the pleasure of working with Gilli back in 2019. We toured together in South Africa, where she's from. We also toured across Europe as well with the show Story Party Tour. And she was the first guest on my podcast for the Story Party Tour as well. So it seemed only fair that she joined me today on my first episode of Not Here to Fuck Spiders. I will also say she's an incredible comedian, probably one of the best joke writers that I know. She also was handpicked by Trevor Noah for his Nationwide tour, touring across South Africa. So, I mean, she's got like one of the top comedians in the world being like, she's funny. So I thought she was the best person to debate this topic, that women aren't funny. Welcome to the first episode, Gilli Apter. Welcome.
Yay!
It's only, I mentioned in the intro that you were my first guest on my first podcast, and now you're my first guest on my second podcast. So
who are we to bunk tradition?
Exactly. And even
pleasure.
in the midst of a pandemic, we still will make it work at some point. It's not in person, but it's, and not with a ironing board or a microphone set up, but we, although maybe you have that, I don't know, maybe
you'll never know.
But yeah, so today we talk a lot. I think I message you every time I get frustrated that I'm like, when I'm like, people message like, you're fucking not funny or other sort of stuff. And I wanted to chat today because it's like, I don't know, like, I'm just so over it. I know there's been a few documentaries and stuff out recently about women in comedy and stuff. And I hate even having to say like women in comedy because it's so like fucking stupid that we have to always like, it's always gender specific when we're talking about comedians. But I wanted to get your thoughts on like this whole stereotype of like why women aren't funny. Like why do you think it exists in the world, or why is that like, I don't know.
My first introduction into this notion was with that very famous Vanity Fair article by a guy whose name I don't remember. And, there's a comedian named Bridget Christie who actually, she's got a whole joke about that guy. His name was Christopher Hitchens. He wrote this article about why women aren't funny, and they published it in Vanity Fair, and it's like gives this whole psychological reason about how it's got a few things. One, women don't have to, men are incentivized to be funny for the sake of women so that they can basically have sex, like that's, and procreate, and that's a sort of a evolutionary argument for men being funny, which I think is hilarious. But I remember another argument that he gave, and what's so funny is like how determined he was to prove this thing, that he, really gave it a lot of thought. And he speaks about how basically like the worst thing that can happen to a woman is worse than the worst thing that can happen to a man. Like the sufferings of women are much more severe than the sufferings of men. And he went as far as to talk about how like a woman losing a child, let's say, is the worst thing that can happen to a person. And then for a woman that's dialed up even that much worse. And so that the notion of like the idea that life is more severe for women, and that's why they're not as easy to like, it's not as easy for them to be funny about the world, because the world presents them with a more severe sense of pain and suffering.
Interesting. I think that's I haven't even really thought about that, but then I would argue on the opposite thing to say that like, actually the more trauma you go through, like the funnier you are, because you find that you dig for the humor in that. Like you see that in ethnicities and races that have been oppressed, like they're like the most funny, like it's you find the humor in the pain kind of thing.
Yeah, what's funny to me is like I would take an even different argument, which is that I often think that people are funny for not necessarily any reason. When you have a sense of humor about something, it's almost like an emotion, it's almost like love. It doesn't have to have a reason, and I think we spend a lot of time trying to dissect, the reasons why things are funny and why people are funny. We do that all day. And, you know, it's like, it's part of like the philosophy of being a comedian, I think, and the lifestyle of it, of like trying to figure it out. But I generally have always believed that a lot of people are just funny for no reason.
I would agree with that. I think it's also like, it's such a situational thing as well. And the family that you grew up in, or it's like, you know, maybe this whole like nature versus nurture kind of like
babies are funny. You know what I mean?
So I have
Babies
never,
are funny, and
I have
funny
never
things.
cried with laughter at a comedian, but like I have at my nephew when he was 2 years old, like when he just did something and we were just like crying. I'm like, that's so easy. Like, why?
Yeah, but you know, there's sometimes like I look at my niece and she'll do something like, you know, you won't see this on the podcast version of this, but she used to do this thing when she was like a year and a half, where she would look at us and like look at us through her eyes like this. And she would do these funny things with her eyes, and then we'd laugh, and she'd keep doing it. And I'm like, that's something she discovered on her own.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, she wasn't trying to get our attention. She just was doing something funny. Then she got a response, and then she kept trying to do the funny thing. But I still think the impulse was there, you know?
Yeah. I think you're right. It's funny, like kids, and I listened to this podcast the other day, and they were saying that like kids laugh on average, I think it was, I'm probably going to quote it wrong, but it was something like 300 times in a day or something like this. Like they're just like, they laugh a lot. And then the average adult, it takes them like 3 months to laugh that much. Like, so it was just this weird thing where I'm like, oh my God.
And during COVID, it's every 3 years.
Oh my God. It's like when the pandemic ends, we'll get to like, you know, the 300 times. It's like crazy. But I think what I find the most interesting about this whole, you know, argument, and I'm also going to say that most of the time it's men leading this argument, saying that women aren't funny. Like they just go to so much length.
You get the most insane commentary. I cannot believe the amount of time spent dissecting and explaining why somebody thinks you aren't funny.
Exactly. It's like this dissection of like, they need to scientifically prove that, you know, the women's brains are different to, like, I'm like,
it's like they're doing it to win money. It's like they're doing it for a job, for a living. Like they're going to earn money if they prove that you aren't funny.
I don't know if you've seen this. I wanted to bring it up today because there's actually an article from the BBC, and I don't even know, like the argument from female comics are like, why is this study even being funded? But there was a study that says men are funnier than women, which I'm like, great, because this is just what we need now to have like a research study that says it. And what I thought was really hilarious, because this is the thing, like it's led by a man. So a man led this study, right? And, you know, it's this same kind of thing that like, evidence suggests humor plays a major role in mating. And the lecturer said women tend to look for a sense of humor in a partner as it is strongly correlated to or with intelligence.
Wow. Interesting. You know what's interesting about that is when the whole notion of like men are funnier than women thing happens. The problem with that is like, we can't prove that until, if you're talking about stand-up comedy, for example, right?
Yeah.
We can't prove that until there are an equal amount of women comics as there are men.
Exactly.
And then we can have that argument. I always like, you know, in the South African comedy scene, I like to, my argument is, if there has to be one, like if I'm, I don't know when I'm put in the situation, but somehow I often am, because I've clearly have thought about this. But we've got in South Africa, maybe I want to say 300 comedians in total.
Right.
And I only know this number because I asked a friend of mine who used to run the comedy club, and he used to, you know, do all the booking.
Mm-hmm.
So he would book all the acts. So he knows basically every single act in the country. And he told me that there's about 300 comics in South Africa. And I will say that of those comics, maybe, and at all levels, top to open mic. And I would say out of that number, there are maybe, I want to say 30 women.
Right.
And when I say 30 women, Eleanor, I mean like the person who started last week and up until like the top people who are doing it, right? And if you look at the number of women who are successfully working as comedians out of that number, the percentage is much higher than of the men.
Yeah, but that's because we have to work harder. like twice as hard.
And there's a number of reasons for it. And I think that yeah, that's one of the reasons. I think that the other reason is that we can't be the same. We can't be samey because we're not inured by like everybody being the same as us. With the men, a lot of the time, like they have a lot of the same life experience. And because there's so many of them, they're impacted by one another's comedy, where that doesn't happen to us because we're incredibly varied in our backgrounds and, you know, races and cultures and age as well. So it's like, I think we end up not being affected by each other's comedy as much. But I guess I'm making a different argument now. I mean,
no, I definitely think you're right, because I think, I mean, I do think that there is a lot of maybe this is more in the States. Like I find there's a lot of sort of like female comics that might be the same, but again, that's because the number is higher. And I think this is what most people don't realize is, and I try and sort of relate comedy to politics. Like the amount of women in politics and women in comedy is the same as like men in politics and men in comedy. Like you look at politics and there's probably like 1 or 2 women in a room of like 30 men or something. So, and I that's how I kind of feel about our job. And I was talking to someone the other day, I was like, fuck, like who else, like what other females get this much hate for their job just based on their gender? And I was like, oh fuck, politicians. Like,
you're so right.
And I think they get it worse. Like I think
definitely
like females in politics, like they get death threats and like I want to kill your family kind of shit. Like
yeah
I just get like, no one's gonna want to fuck you, no one's gonna want to marry you, and like women are, you're fucking ugly, you're fat. Someone called me obese the other day on my YouTube comments. I'm like, I like
at least be factual, you know, with your like
this is the thing, they're so not, but it's yeah, I don't know. But I think coming back to this BBC article,
yes,
you know, saying that you know, humor is strongly correlated with intelligence. I don't know about you, but I fucked a lot of male comics and that's not true. So I don't know if you feel this.
I'm trying to understand what the correlation is. So you're saying that you didn't need your intelligence to do that?
I'm saying,
or you're saying they didn't need their intelligence to do that?
They don't have intelligence.
I see.
Maybe, I don't know, but a bit of both, maybe. I don't know, but maybe I'm the dumb one for sleeping with them. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know.
No, I want to pass out your argument. I don't think sex has anything to do with intelligence, and I think that's where the waters are becoming murky in this argument. Nobody has to be smart to have sex, you know.
I think also it's given the fact that we are in comedy and we are surrounded mostly by men, mostly like straight men, and we don't have a chance to really meet normal people and to date normal people. So yeah,
I will say that I do think comedians, I think good comedians are intelligent.
Yeah.
How about that?
Clearly that's not me.
I think good comedians are intelligent. So, you know, that's how I like to think about it. If I think about our scene, so like the other night I was doing a show, and in the middle of my joke, like it was a very small gig, and a couple came in, and there's this tall, like beautiful woman with a guy, and they were both very drunk. And I was talking and I was just stalling until she got to her chair so I could finish my joke, because she came in like while I was building, you know, and I was like, you know what, I'm not giving this away. I'm going to wait for them to settle down. And I was just like joking around while she sat down. And then she started talking back to me. Oh, wow. And I said to her, you know, I was like, okay, I was like, listen here, we're going to talk about this. And then all the male comics were sitting on the side and like watching, and their eyes were growing huge. And I just said to her, you know, I'm going to say this to you now. I know this looks like a conversation, but it isn't. So I looked at the guys and I was like, I want you guys to know I'm going to take one for the team now. And I just said to her, you know, I'm saying this to you because that you're going to learn the hard way otherwise with those guys. I was like, I've got nothing to gain from this interaction, so I'm telling you the truth.
Yeah.
And the guys were all shivering in the corner. They were like, ooh, ah, ooh. Like I wasn't feeling any tension at all, but they were like, and I just looked at them in a group and I just thought like, oh, this is who I'm dealing with. These are, you know, this is the thing that I'm like forced to compete with. And this is what I'm dealing with when people are like, oh, male comics are better than female, all of that stuff. And I'm like, but look at them.
They're scared. They're scared to probably, I mean, it maybe even at the moment, like the male comics are scared to say something to a female comic on stage because, you know, something might happen. But I think it's really interesting with like I was heckled once by a female audience member, and it's quite weird because most of the time I've been heckled by men, and when I got heckled by a woman, I was like, I thought you were on my team. I'm like, what are you doing?
I often get heckled by women. It's usually it's a drunk white woman.
Well, yeah, it was a drunk white woman.
Yeah. And that's, you know, in South Africa, where like a lot of our audiences are majority Black audiences, that's why it stands out, because, you know, we're not always performing for like all white crowds, you know.
But then I feel like but
sure enough, anytime there's a woman, sure enough, it's a drunk white woman.
Yeah. But does that mean all the audience is on your side, or like
people are often on your side when somebody's drunk and heckling you? You know what I mean? Because it's bothering them as well.
Yeah, and they're like, I think it's also this thing, and I know I do it when I'm in the audience. I'm like, how are they going to deal with this one? Like, it's kind of like, what's going to happen?
My new way to deal with hecklers is I just go shh, and I carry on. Yeah, shh, and I just carry on.
I like.
Yeah, it's very effective.
Yeah. I generally just talk back to them, and then I'm like, I made the mistake of like I had this one guy, which I probably shouldn't really have done it, but he just yelled out like my entire set. And this is when I was doing more like burlesque cabaret kind of stuff. And he was like, slut. He just kept yelling like every 30 seconds, slut. And he was so drunk, and he was like, you're a slut. I just kept doing it like the entire time. And I just like, I don't know, I get like a kindergarten teacher on people that are like that. I'm just like, I went up to him and I was like, are you okay? This was super patronizing, and then I'm like, just take my hand. Okay, take my hand, we're just gonna go for a little walk.
And that would never happen in any other show other than comedy. Never.
No, I know.
Like if you were at the ballet, you know, and the swan is dying, and like you know, she's doing like the final whatever the thing is, and it's like da, 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 da. And imagine a person being like standing up and going, yo, fuck that swan, give me my money back, and then like the swan has to pay it. I mean,
exactly, like, oh, you can't, like something like that. It's just like in the middle of this like beautiful, or I can see your flaps, like something like totally like weird or something.
You swan slut.
You're a slut.
And all the other swans, they're also sluts.
Yeah, exactly. Just slut. You're also a slut. Just pointing everyone out individually. The one in the black, you're a slut. It's just like,
I want to know how the comments that you get actually make you feel. Do they make you emotional in some way?
Wow, that's a good question. I talk quite often with my therapist, which is like quite good. Yeah, a little bit. I think also because the comments are always the same in terms of like, women aren't funny, all you talk about is sex, and you're ugly. Like, which for me, like the first two, I'm like, okay, like that's your opinion, or like whatever, I don't really give a shit. But when they do attack like your physical appearance, it's a little bit like, it does get you a little bit, I don't know.
That's interesting.
A bit upset about it, but I think everything that I've gone through in the last couple of years mentally is kind of like, I don't know, I feel like that's like the least of my, like being told I'm ugly by a random YouTuber is like down here, like on the list of like things to work through. So
it's so crazy because you have created, like in the last couple of years, you have toured a show about dating and sex in every city in the world pretty much. So you have got like, it's the perfect sort of experiment ground for the data on how people react to the subject coming from a woman. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
All over the world.
Exactly. And it's like, I mean, that's been great, but then people are like, why do you everything's about sex? I'm like, that's because I was specifically working on a show that was about dating and sex. So like, maybe if you knew that about me, maybe you would kind of do that. But it's also weird because someone was like, messaged me, who follows me, like messaged me yesterday, and he's like,
but nobody would say that to your male co-comedian who's been touring the world with you and doing the exact same thing as you all over the world.
Exactly, because I've seen the comments that he would get on YouTube, and I saw the comments that I would get, and it was like, it was unbelievable. Like I would just look at them and be like, okay, that's what a male comic gets, cool. Oh, this is what a female comic gets. Like, so it's very different. But yeah, like this guy like slid into my DMs like yesterday, and follows me as well. So it's like, I don't know if you're a fan or not, but he was like, why would I want to come to your new show when all it's going to be about is sex? And I'm like, okay,
why are you here?
Exactly. But also,
why
like,
are you here?
Why are you assuming that my new show is going to be about sex? Like, what do you know what it's going to be about, you know?
Yeah. But why are you even engaging with me?
Exactly.
You know, when I see something I don't like,
yeah,
I don't engage with that thing anymore.
Exactly. But I think it's just, yeah, exactly. But I think it's also this thing where like, it's just getting a reaction out of someone or this kind of stuff, which is fine and fair enough. But yeah, it's weird. But then that's also the other thing. It's like as you grow old or you're older or your circumstances change, like I'm no longer working on a show that's all about sex and dating. So now I'm like, oh fuck, I can talk about anything. I can do whatever I want.
Yes. You were quite limited in that space because that's what it was about.
How does it affect you with comments and stuff?
You know, I don't get a lot of stuff because I don't have a very big following or audience. But the other day there was a woman who posted something. It wasn't a sexist comment, but she said something like, who is this? Is this supposed to be funny? I've just wasted my time. Or something about me being liberal or something.
Yeah.
And I just was like, I get so excited because I feel like, oh, when I see a comment from a stranger, I just get excited because I feel like it's a sign of success. And then I just screen grab it, send it to all my friends, and then block her.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Block is the best thing to do. It's the absolute
and the reason I block, and I don't, you know, it depends. Like I didn't delete the comment because I like there to be like a variety of opinion.
Of course.
But I don't want negativity.
Yeah.
Like that kind of, you know, I don't want like any kind of hatefulness.
Yeah.
So
I agree.
That's the only reason
I think the same thing, like even because I look at the comments, like I have to approve them that come through. But for me, it's like if there's someone who actually has like I don't know, like a different idea or something like that, I'm like, okay, cool. Like that's a thought that you have. But if it's just going to be like, women aren't funny, you're ugly, I'm like, I'm not going to approve that because I don't want people to be like, yeah, she's fucking ugly. Look at her fucking nose. Like I don't want that.
This is my page. Thank you very much.
Exactly. You know, like, on other pages, go for your life. Like, start a blog. I don't.
It's like somebody knocking on your door and just coming into your house and be like, just call you ugly all day.
Exactly.
And just be in your space, you know?
Yeah. I had a guy yesterday being like, are you missing teeth? Because I think you need to get that fixed. I was like, oh, for fuck's sake, are we going this deep now? I was like, yes, I'm missing teeth, but fuck, like, you don't know my background. Go fuck yourself. Anyway, so.
There is. I want you to know that I see these comments as a sign of your success.
Yeah, but like they just don't make sense. Like, okay, so here is, I mean, the one I posted the other day, which was psychotic from that
it was psychotic.
That guy.
I sent it to another friend of mine a guy who I've told him about, like, he's quite curious about comedy and women in comedy and how I'm doing what I'm doing. And so I sent him that thing and he was just stunned. He just couldn't believe what he was reading.
Okay, there's this one. This guy wrote a while ago, he wrote, male comedians usually joke about what they perceive in the world because deep down they love the world, but don't really care about themselves, usually depressed in brackets, because they don't care about themselves. They can look past their own image and make fun of anything. Yeah? He goes on, female comedians usually joke about how the world perceives them because deep down they care a lot about appearance. It always comes back to the self. That's why they can consistently joke about biology, being fat, bad sex, and birth. Think how Robin Williams...
Not because we have an intimate experience with birth.
No, right? Like, exactly. Think how Robin Williams could go from politics, sports, movies, impressions, and sex. Now you may be thinking, no fair, you just chose one of the very best. That's the thing though, female comedians can only aspire to be as good as the best female comic. Not one of them is getting into the Chappelle, Bill Burr, Norm Macdonald, Jim Gaffigan, Louis C.K., Jimmy Carr, Foster Brooks, Patrice O'Neill, and Robin Williams category. That was one of my favorite ones. Wow.
Really thought through, you know, and like spend some time there. He spent some time. You know what's so problematic about the way comparisons are made is that it's just not, there's no even playing field to be had. When you talk about any comedian who is over the age of 50, there just weren't the numbers, like, you know, and for so many reasons that women couldn't do other things, they couldn't do comedy either.
Exactly. Like look at the trailblazers. Trailblazers like Joan Rivers. Like for her in
Yeah.
that time to do what she did. But she found such like an audience in gay men. Like she's such a gay icon for that,
Yes.
because really, I mean, straight men weren't going to watch someone like her.
And
like,
that's who listened to her. So she then went and made the kind of comedy that would appeal to her audience. But it's like, it's so hard when you're trying to compare numbers, because there wasn't an opportunity for women, so they couldn't do the job.
Exactly. It's like anything with the the female
it's any field.
Exactly. But I think it's also like with this latest video that's like kind of mine that I'm getting a lot of the hate on. It's because within the first minute and a half, I talk about, I use the word feminism. Like I just say feminism, and
you think that's the trigger?
Definitely,
wow.
because it's like the first 2 minutes, and like that's the whole joke about like there's a joke in there saying like, oh, I could have gone all feminist on this guy for telling me that how to use gym equipment, but like instead I was like, oh my god, I want to fuck this guy, like, and that in itself is satire on women and how we feel, because we're like,
I think the problem there for a man like that who hears that joke is there's deceit and trickery.
Yeah.
And women are deceiving and tricky.
They're manipulative.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yes, and it's all to prevent that man from having sex with you as well, because that's what he wants.
Yeah. But also,
so he's now thinking about his relationship with somebody who's deceived and tricked him into not having sex with him.
Exactly. And you know what I find funny about that comment that was like, oh, women are insecure and all this sort of stuff? I'm like, no, men are insecure because every time people say, oh, it's only because the guy's hot that you didn't like go all feminist on him. But if he was ugly, you would have gone feminist. And I was like, you're just being insecure now, like calling us insecure and yeah, I don't know, it's
you can't have it both ways.
No, exactly. I think there's this one as well, which I thought it also highlights a bigger thing about female comics, but it says all women comedians talk about is sex, which I don't think is true, because like I think you're like the cleanest like comic that I've ever like worked with in terms of like,
I never talk about sex pretty much.
Not really. Like, and I was like, you're so clever with your joke writing, like it's unbelievable. And then when people sort of say, oh, women only talk about sex or like blah blah blah, and I'm like, no, there's actually some really clever comics like yourself who are joke writers.
I actually really was that the comment? Women only talk about sex?
No, he says women comedians talk about is sex, and this is a common one I get all the time. It's women aren't funny.
I get it as well.
All women aren't funny. All women talk about is sex, and she's ugly. Basically, they're the three main comments I always get on my channel. But he says all women comedians talk about is sex. All minority comedians talk about race and culture. Jewish comedians talk about being Jewish. Caucasian men just talk about marriage. Lol. Like that was what he wrote. I'm like, thank you.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack.
Right.
I will say this is the thing about women and talking about sex for me, is that comedians talk about life, and sex is a massive part of life. And so what happens is all comedians talk a lot about sex. It's just that women are singled out for it because this kind of man and a large part of society is not accustomed to women talking openly about their sexuality.
Yeah.
And it's because we don't do it in the world. At least I know in like South African society, we're quite conservative when it comes to sex. So we're not brash when we talk about sex in conversation. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So then what happens is society isn't accustomed to women talking about sex. Then a woman comes on stage and talks about sex and everyone's shocked. And I of course it's to do with misogyny to some extent that exists in our society. Mm-hmm. But I also think that there is a simple issue of, because of that, it's not necessarily just misogyny in the room towards a woman talking about sex on stage. It's more to do with the fact that I think the audience simply isn't accustomed to it. And so it's shocking for them, and they're preoccupied with the idea that it's even happening, so that they can't let their guard down to even listen to what's going on. And I have to say, like, for a long time, before I did comedy, I kind of was, I was quite judgmental about women talking about sex. And I think I held the same view. And that's why I think now I can I can sort of see where it comes from, because I had the same primitive mentality.
Right.
And it is primitive, but it's just because of what we're exposed to. The more I got exposed to it, the more I understood that it wasn't women doing it, it was comedians doing it.
Yeah.
And that anybody should be able to talk about anything. I watched Nikki Glazer's special. I've forgotten what it's called.
The latest one that she did on Netflix.
Yes.
Yeah. I started watching it, but I sort of tend to avoid watching a lot of female comics just because I know we talk about the same thing. Right. So it's difficult to but I love her stuff. Like, she's an incredible writer.
So she is hilarious. And I started watching that special, and I got through about 5 or 10 minutes of it. And I am intellectually, I have got no problem with women talking about sex, with anyone talking about anything really. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of wide open to what I think people should or shouldn't be able to talk about. But I think instinctively I react strongly against one thing or another, right? Historically, I've always reacted in a way that watching a woman talk about sex is hard for me. Mm-hmm. And it's because I'm like that in life. I'm a bit of a prude. And so for me, it's because I'm conservative in the way that I approach sex anyway, right? So for me, it's always been a thing of like, oh, this is hard for me to watch. I don't enjoy it. Mm. And then I went back to it and I watched it. And I had a complete turnaround in my feeling about it.
Right.
Because it was so good. And it was almost like I had to have a breakthrough about watching her talk openly about sex. I had to, even me, the person who is on stage, I watch women talk about sex all the time. And one of my favorite specials is Ali Wong's Baby Cobra. And in that, there is a 5-minute segment that is just about anal. And it is the funniest piece of comedy that exists. Mm-hmm. On Netflix. It is so funny. And I even had to do a thing where I went like, what is your problem? And it was my problem. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. It was my problem.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because I sent her a DM.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. I sent her a DM and I was like, I don't know where this will go, but I was like, I want you to know that like I used to have a problem and I didn't realize that I even had a problem. I thought I was open and liberal in my mind until I watched your special through, and it was so good. And I realized that I'm actually a prude, and it made me realize how everybody thinks when it took me through that mentality that people have about it. And she wrote me back and she said, she said, I had the same. She was like, I'm not nearly as wild as it seems I am. She's like, I'm just being honest. And I had the same mentality about it that you do, that you say you have.
This is Nikki Glaser or Ellie Wong?
Yes.
Nikki Glaser.
Nikki Glaser. Yeah, so even a person who's doing the comedy has their own judgments about it. And it's like, it's just because of what we're conditioned to experiencing.
Totally.
That's all it is.
Totally. I think you're absolutely right. And I think I noticed that a lot of the time when we were doing shows in more conservative countries, mainly actually the worst countries in terms of like, the pullback, like we would always say, like, the pullback in comment, like when the audience kind of goes, oh, I don't know if I really want to talk about this.
That's such a good way to describe it.
Yeah. And it was New Zealand, England, Jamaica, in part South Africa. I remember when I first went there, I was like, oh, I think I'm a little bit too much for, like, it took me a while.
I remember watching it.
And I was like, okay. And for me, like, I realized that it's just a cultural thing, or if it's in some parts, even in Singapore as well, there was a very kind of like, and also in places like Singapore where most people live with their parents, they're not as open, I guess, sexually as we are maybe in America, Australia, or in Europe or wherever. So it's definitely a big cultural thing. And for me, like, I sometimes forget because I've just like, I don't know, I'm from Australia, like we're disgusting. Like we openly talk about everything.
Yeah, I was on tour at the end of last year and went to lots of small towns all across the country. And I struggled so much. And I specifically, one of the reasons I did this tour, I mean, not that I was like, I had 4 million other things to do, but I knew it was going to be tough because I know the audience of the particular comedian that I was touring with, and it was his tour. that he invited me on. And I knew it was going to be hard. And I just couldn't believe it wasn't, I didn't even have to talk about anything. It was just me stepping out on stage and I got the pullback.
Oh, wow.
You know, before I'd even reach the mic, I would get that pullback from the audience because they're not even used to seeing a woman in that context. So never mind a woman now talking about sex, that like really explodes their brains. They can't even believe you're up there half the time.
Wow, that's unbelievable.
You know?
Yeah.
They've just never seen it.
Yeah, I figured I realized that. And I also know,
Yeah.
I mean, we were lucky like doing Story Party because, you know, it was mainly women we were performing to. So there wasn't so much of a like, oh, fuck, like what's a woman doing on stage? Whereas in times I've done comedy clubs or at times I've done shows in front of a majority male audience, forget it. Like, it's like they pull back, they go to the bar, they go to the top. Like, whenever I get on stage, I don't know if you know, like if you see
I find that it's quite tricky either way. I find it really depends on what the scenario is. For example, in South Africa, it depends on the context, right? So I did a show for the South African like water aerobics organization or something.
Amazing.
Yeah. And they were like 40 women and they were all over the age of 50 and they were all white. I say this because I'm going to counter it with something else. And it was so uptight that I could not, it was so hard to get them to loosen up. And it was as bad as performing in front of an audience, like full of anyone really. It didn't matter. I've had other scenarios like that, like a tea, you know, it also depends on the environment and, you know, that's why it's so hard to judge because your environment is always changing. Whereas like I did an event, it was a corporate function for Verve Clicquot. They had a big event at the Four Seasons Hotel. And I performed for an audience of like maybe 100 women. And I'm trying to think if I think they were mostly Black between the ages of like 25 and 45. And it went exceptionally well. And there were 2 female comedians on the lineup and they loved us, you know? Yeah. And so it depends on like, in South Africa, race means something only to the extent that it's so particular. Like, so those white women weren't just white women, they were white women who were over a certain age and were quite conservative. You know what I mean? So it's not necessarily fair to say, oh, that white women make terrible audiences or that Black women make great audiences. It's not necessarily like that. It just depends on the context so much. But I felt the pullback sometimes from female audiences because even they are not accustomed to necessarily seeing a woman do comedy, you know?
Oh, of course.
And so it's not fair necessarily for me to say that the Black audience was better because they were at an all-women event where they were being empowered and that environment was like, oh, it's about champagne. And so it has a certain kind of cool clientele that the other event didn't have. Those people are not cool, you know, that I was performing to. So it's like, it's so tricky to tell from one thing to the next, but I can tell you that my toughest audience is a small town audience. And it doesn't matter if it's men or women or whatever it is. If it's small town, it's a struggle.
Yeah, because it's almost as though, and I know this coming from a small town in Australia, it's like you sort of have to always make jokes that are local, and then they're like, oh, like then they agree with it. But I think the thing is that people don't understand, especially like when you watch comedy on YouTube or you watch comedy on Netflix and stuff, is that like the way that we perform comedy in a comedy club or that is so I don't know, orchestrated in a sense. So the best comedy shows are always in a small, like low
you're so right. It is orchestrated,
dark. Like we manipulate the audience because we want them to laugh, and we have alcohol and we have dark rooms, so you feel like you don't feel
you're
like
safe.
There's not a lot of light, so you feel like exposed. I can laugh at this joke. Everything like that. And the thing is, when people watch comedy on YouTube or they watch it on Netflix or whatever, and they've got these strong opinions, it's that like they're in their room, they're maybe distracted on their phone and they're like, oh, I'm not really in it. But when you're in it, like you're in this world. And that's the most amazing thing about stand-up comedy and theater and art in general, like live theater, live music, whatever, is that you're just in the moment and you're there and you're laughing. And then, because I've even seen, like, when we've done shows, like I would laugh at some jokes and stuff like that, but sometimes I would sit back and be like, why are they laughing? Like, but it's because
right. We've curated this thing.
Exactly.
We've curated this thing for you to laugh. And sometimes, like, I get like, I'll notice that I'm doing something in a certain rhythm, and then I'll just say something where it's got the same rhythm as the joke, and people will laugh because there's a punctuation that tells them, oh, now's the right time to laugh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's the same as like charisma or, your stage presence or things like that. Like, one of my favorite comedians is Godfrey. Do you know Godfrey? He's a comic from New York. And
yes, I know the guy who screams a lot.
Yeah, he kind of screams. And like, I saw him live. Godfrey, yeah, and he does a podcast, I think, in Godfrey We Trust. And I met him like in New York.
Maybe I don't. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'll send you a link anyway. Person. But he's hilarious. I saw him at like the Gotham Comedy Club, and I saw him at the Cellar, and then I saw him in LA as well when I was there, because I was like, oh my God, he's here. I've got to go see him. But the way he performs when he's on stage, he rarely does like the same material twice. So you always see something new. But he's just like brilliant with his face and his voices. And it's just, and I've watched him on YouTube and I'm like, doesn't translate. Like it doesn't work for me. Like, because I know how electrifying he is in live, like live. Yes. So it's just one of those things where I'm like, okay, maybe, these people who are commenting like, I hate female comics. It's like, well, have you seen them live, or have you seen them like in person? Like,
I also think that people forget, I always say this, like, people forget that why they come to comedy. There's something in, they think they're coming to laugh, which is obviously the main reason why they're coming. But part of the reason you come to live comedy as opposed to watching it on your screen is for the element of thrill.
Yeah.
The notion that like anything can happen, because the anything can happen doesn't exist once it's on Netflix.
No.
When you're in the room with the comedian, anything can happen. And sometimes crazy shit happens. And people get afraid of it and they're nervous about it, but they don't realize that's part of the reason they're there.
Exactly. I think that's a very wise thing to possibly end on. That was a really nice little wrap up, and to like be like, but I'm super excited for when, the world goes back to some kind of normal and we're able to, have that thrill in person again, because it's like, it's so much fun. And as the comedian, like, you're also shit scared as well, because you're like, I don't know what's going to happen tonight. You're like,
no, we're all on a ride together.
Am I going to remember everything? But anyway, thank you so much for just natting it out on my first little episode of my podcast. I'm very excited to have you back on the airwaves, or like whatever this is, with me. It's been great.
This has been such a pleasure.
Oh, as always, Gilli Apter. And I'll put all your socials in the link below, and people can follow you and check you out. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for watching the first episode of Not Here Among Spiders. If you like this episode, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications here on my YouTube channel. Thank you all so much for subscribing. I'm blown away by how many people have subscribed to my channel in the last few months. And I'm really looking forward to putting out more videos and content for you all. So thank you so much, and I'll see you soon. Ciao.